So I am a cardiology consultant by trade. I also happen to have a degree in infectious diseases and an interest in cardiovascular research with a couple of degrees in that. I've been involved with long COVID and the cardiovascular complications of COVID right from the beginning of the pandemic. I was re-rolled to go and run an acute COVID ward, so I've experienced doing that at the RVI in Newcastle, which is one of the big two HSID hospitals. I set up one of the first cardiovascular long COVID complications clinic, which I ran for a year. I then moved into research. I'm part of an international research collaborative. I'm involved in a series of research trials that are in various setups, really looking at the pathophysiology, the host response to the infection, and how we can develop therapeutic targets to try and treat that to reduce the level of disease and disability in patients suffering from long COVID. So I'm going to start by saying something slightly controversial. I cried today. And the reason I cried is because I was on the phone to a patient. And this is a patient that Claire Taylor, who can't be here because she's dealing with another emergency, and I have a mutual involvement in. And I have permission just to kind of spend a couple of seconds explaining why. This is a patient who is a young male who is in his 30s. I'm going to call him Ben, but that's not his real name. And this is just a classical example of what we're seeing in the clinics. So Ben, who's not his real name, was in his early 30s. He was fit and healthy. He's ex-military, running his own business, engaged to be married, and then COVID hit. Now, he didn't die from COVID, but he was affected. He had a heart attack in his 30s. And he has subsequently had a roller coaster of what is potentially a complete nightmare. He's had ongoing symptoms. He's gone from running his own business and being engaged to being largely, he's housebound, largely bedbound. He's had to move back in with his parents. He now has no home. He has no fiance. He has no business. And to make things worse, there's still a lack of understanding in the medical communities about how to investigate this condition properly and how to manage it properly. And one of the issues is a lot of the standard imaging tests and blood tests come back negative. And that's not because the patient's okay. It's not because it's all in their head. It's not because there's nothing wrong. It's because COVID, and we know this now, and David Fedson no doubt will talk to you about this in a lot more detail, but long COVID is predominantly a vascular disease, not a respiratory illness. And it is predominantly a disease of the microvasculature as well. So what we're seeing with long COVID is we're seeing it enters through the respiratory tract, but then in the blood vessels, you're getting this chronically stimulated immune response, you're getting maladaptive innate immune response, you're getting a chronically stimulated T lymphocytes that are chucking out lots of cytokines in response to the viral antigen, the spike protein. And they are becoming chronically stimulated and you're getting immune exhaustion. So therefore, you're probably at increased risk of further infections because you're becoming immunocompromised with reduced T cell, productive T cell activity. But in addition to that, these pro-inflammatory cytokines are inflaming the inner linings of the blood vessels called the endothelium. That then triggers another response where you get platelet activation, which are the molecules involved in blood clotting, and it triggers the coagulation cascade, and you end up with this cytokine and clot soup. Now, in long COVID, these clots are very small. They're amyloid microclots. And the other thing that's important to mention is they're not normal clots. In the presence of spike protein, fibrin, which is the molecule that's involved in the clotting, becomes misfolded, and it becomes misfolded into an amyloid formation. And when it does that, it also traps other molecules inside it. So you end up with these fibrin amyloid microclots that are resistant to fibrinolysis, which means the body is struggling to break them down. And if you make too many of these clots, what we believe is happening is these clots are getting sequestered or stuck, we think, in the capillary vascular beds. And when you have enough of these, it is obstructing the flow of oxygen to every single organ in your body. And that is what is causing the symptoms of long COVID. But in addition to that, we think the clots themselves are immunogenic. And so you get inflammation at the site in the capillaries. The capillaries are not as well protected as the larger blood vessels because they don't have a tunica adventitia or basement or a tunica media, and so they become inflamed, and then you get this disruption of the capillary integrity, and you get leakage of the inflammatory molecules into the other organs, and you get organ damage. For example, there's lots of evidence now showing damage, neuroinflammatory damage in the brains of individuals with long COVID, in the hearts of individuals with long COVID. But in addition to this, you've got all these prothrombotic tendencies where you end up with things like heart attacks and strokes and various other issues. Now, when it comes to the long COVID, this is one of the things that we're not talking about. So although the death rates are going down, the disability rates are going up. We have 148 million people with this condition now. I spoke to this gentleman on the phone today. He had clearly seen multiple different doctors. He clearly had undiagnosed postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome that has been completely missed. And he's very disabled as a result of it. And when I sat him down and we talked him through and we did the test that a lot of other medics are not doing because they're maybe not specialists in this area, he cried. I have had a 30-year-old man sobbing his heart out to me on the phone. And sorry, I'm actually getting quite emotional about it because this is happening all the time.
Yeah.
And some of it is treatable if we can just get a better campaign of education, which is what we're trying to do through the World Health Network, to train other doctors so that we can get it accepted that there are tests that you can do that can diagnose some of these abnormalities. And there are treatments we already have. There's lots of treatments we're still testing, but there are treatments we already have that can help reduce the level of disability. And this is the message we need to get out. But the other message we need to get out is that there's very clear evidence from the published literature that reinfection increases your risk of long COVID substantially. So we have to have some sensible public health mitigations, because I have seen the inner lining of people's blood vessels. I've seen the torn endothelium. That's after 1 and 2 infections. I have no idea what their blood's going to look like after 10. Okay, I'm going to skip through the first slides, but obviously I'm a cardiologist as well as doing a lot of work with long COVID. I have significant concerns about the cardiovascular side effects that we're seeing, not just in long COVID patients, but in anyone that's had COVID. I'm not going to go into too much detail. These are some landmark studies. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically there are loads of them now with millions of patients. All of them are showing that there's a significant risk of cardiovascular events following COVID infection. This is myocarditis in one of my own patients that I've reproduced with permission. There's also significant evidence that even if you are not getting cardiovascular complications after your first infection or long COVID after your first infection, there's a significant risk that you may get it after subsequent infections. And reinfection increases your risk of long COVID, cardiovascular complications, neurological complications, GI complications, endocrine complications, long COVID hospitalization and death. So 2.5 years into the pandemic, from a heart perspective, what do we know? We know that if you catch COVID, even if you're asymptomatic with index infection, even if your index acute illness is mild and you're non-hospitalized, you are at increased risk of acute coronary syndrome, myocardial infarction, cardiomyopathy, cardiac arrest, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, myocarditis, pericarditis, pulmonary embolus, which is blood clots in the lungs that Claire's been talking about. And a lot of these are getting missed because we're seeing them in a different pattern. They're microemboli and they're not being picked up with the standard tests. And we need to change the tests we're doing: deep venous thrombosis, stroke, and TIA. For 1 minute, I just want to talk about what is the potential longer term outlook though going forward. Now, obviously, I can't say anything for certain because it's not happened yet, but I can make an educated guess. And it's not just a guess, it's based on science. And this is my concern. My concern is that COVID, as we already know now, is causing endothelial damage. Endothelial damage is damage to the inner lining of our blood vessels. So it's inflammation of the inner lining of our blood vessels. Now, the virus is doing this through both direct infection and through the host response via cytokines. There are loads of publications now confirming that patients who have had SARS-CoV-2, and you don't necessarily need to just have had long COVID, this is just anyone who's been infected to some degree or another, may have endothelial dysfunction. Why are we worried about this as cardiologists? Well, I'm worried about it for two reasons. I'm a cardiologist, but I also have a specialist interest in long COVID. Endothelial dysfunction, as you can see here, is one of the key players in the development of long COVID. And we've talked about that previously, and I'll not go into it now. But also endothelial dysfunction is the precursor event for the development of atherosclerosis, and that is the disease process that causes cardiovascular disease, specifically heart attack, angina, stroke, vascular dementia, and peripheral vascular disease. So even if the mild infection, even if the acute infection is mild, even if people are not dying from it, even if they're vaccinated to some degree, SARS-CoV-2 still is not and never has been just a cold, because this is about the longer term implications. And what we know from the science already is that there is clear evidence of cardiovascular and thrombotic complications in acute COVID. There is clear evidence of cardiovascular and thrombotic complications in the medium term, in the 2.5 years we've had to study this. But going forward, I think there may be a significant risk of cardiovascular complications in the longer term, and this most likely is going to be mediated through endothelial dysfunction, and it needs urgent research. I hope to God I'm wrong. I would never want to be more wrong in my life, but what we're seeing so far is that COVID is causing endothelial dysfunction, and what we need to find out is it causing endothelial dysfunction in absolutely everyone who's getting infected? And if it is it healing by itself or not? Because worst case scenario, if everybody's getting endothelial dysfunction, and if it's not healing, and if we've got 605 million people infected who've been infected with COVID around the globe, and we do nothing about this, then my concern is that we're going to see a tsunami of cardiovascular disease over the next few decades. And by that, I mean heart attack, stroke, vascular dementia. So with that in mind, I am worried that we've lifted lots of all COVID restrictions in many countries without putting in any mitigations to stop reinfection, because we know reinfection makes the matter worse. And really, I think there has to be some very sensible public health discussions at a country level, maybe at a global level, about what we do about this going forward, because COVID's not going anywhere. It's not going to go away, and we have to learn to live with it, as Maria quite clearly said, safely.